In August of 1944, Greta and 83 other German women were crammed together in the hold of a ship crossing the Atlantic. The air inside was thick and stifling, heavy with the scent of salt water, engine grease, and the sweat of bodies pressed too close for comfort. The journey, which would take weeks, felt like an eternity. The women, most of whom had been captured during the Allied advance, sat in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts or whispering in hushed tones to their neighbors. Fear and uncertainty hung in the air like a dark cloud. The ship was a grim reminder of their fate. They were being transported not as soldiers but as prisoners, cargo to be delivered to a foreign land. The warnings they had received in German propaganda ran through Greta's mind. Americans were savages. They would treat them like animals. They would starve them or worse. Every new whisper, every small noise seemed to add to the mounting terror. But despite the fear, Greta couldn't help but wonder what the truth of their captivity would be. She had always heard that the Americans were brutal, cruel, and devoid of any humanity. Yet the silence on the ship told a different story. Greta held tightly to the only thing she had left from her old life, a photograph of her daughter, Anneliese. The photo was small, carefully hidden inside the folds of her clothing, a fragile symbol of the life she hoped to return to. It had been over a year since she had last seen her little girl. The thought of her daughter, lost in a world of uncertainty, caused Greta's chest to tighten. She kept the image close, as though the mere presence of it could shield her from the unknown horrors that lay ahead. In the pitch black of the cargo hold, the women could only make out vague shapes of each other. They huddled together for warmth, trying to preserve any semblance of human connection despite the crushing despair. Each woman was consumed by her own dread. Greta had heard the stories about how American soldiers would strip prisoners of their dignity, how they would treat them like animals. But now, as the days stretched on and the ship slowly cut through the waves, she wondered whether these stories were simply the products of fear and hate. Perhaps the truth would be different. The boat creaked and groaned, the metallic noises echoing through the ship's hull, sending a shiver down Greta's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something far worse than anything they had already endured. The silence, the lack of anger, the complete indifference of their captors was unsettling. It was as if the Americans had no emotional investment in them at all, just another shipment of cargo to deal with. This apathy was more unnerving than the violence she had expected. As they sailed further into the unknown, Greta's mind raced through memories of the past few years, of war, of loss, of the brutal fighting that had torn her country apart. She thought about Anneliese again. Would she even recognize her mother when they finally reunited? Would the child she had been before the war still be there? Or would the years of conflict have turned her into something else entirely? Greta clutched the photograph tighter, as if holding it could somehow bridge the gap between the past and the uncertain future. The women's whispers became more frequent as the days wore on, growing louder with each passing hour. Each one of them carried a burden of fear, of regret, of confusion. No one knew what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. The propaganda had painted a clear picture of the Americans as heartless oppressors. But here they were, trapped between two versions of reality, the one they had been taught to believe and the one they were experiencing firsthand. Greta felt her stomach tighten with each passing day. The reality of their situation was slowly sinking in. They were not soldiers fighting for a cause. They were prisoners, stripped of their agency, their humanity, and sent to an unknown destination where survival was all that mattered. Yet, despite everything, there was a small, stubborn part of her that refused to believe the worst. Could the Americans truly be as bad as they had been painted? Or was there something else? something beyond the cruelty that had been so deeply embedded in her psyche. The ship finally approached its destination. The women were told nothing, given no clues as to where they were. They were simply herded off the ship, their future uncertain. The sun beat down mercilessly as they made their way to the docks, the heat of Texas unlike anything Greta had ever felt before. It was an unfamiliar land, a world far removed from everything she had known. The soldiers, their faces unreadable, stood at attention, watching the women without a word. Greta's heart pounded in her chest as they marched toward the camp, each step a reminder that she had left behind everything she had ever known. No longer a soldier, no longer a mother. She was simply another prisoner, a number among many. The fear that had gripped her since the moment of her capture intensified as the gates of the camp loomed closer. But there was something else, too, something she couldn't name. A sense of disorientation, of disbelief that this could be real. Could this really be the beginning of the end, or was it just another step in an endless cycle of violence and hate? As they crossed into the camp, the women were divided into smaller groups. Greta felt a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward a table where an American woman sat. The woman's expression was tired, but her gaze was direct and steady. She spoke in English first, then switched to German when she realized that Greta didn't understand. It was the first real contact they had had with any of the camp officials, and as the woman's pen moved across the paper, Greta couldn't help but wonder, was this the face of the enemy, or was there something else hiding behind the surface? The photograph of her daughter still clenched tightly in her hand, Greta didn't know what to expect next. She only knew one thing: her world was about to change forever. As Greta stepped through the gates of the camp, she was immediately struck by the sharp contrast to the dark, oppressive atmosphere she had been expecting. The camp, Camp Co, Texas, was not the hellhole of brutality she had imagined, but a sprawling compound with neat rows of wooden barracks painted in a cheerful pale yellow. The air, though hot and dry, felt cleaner than the stifling air aboard the ship. There were no angry shouts or rough gestures from the guards. Instead, they stood quietly, almost indifferently, guiding the prisoners forward with minimal interaction. It was as if the whole situation were so routine to them that it hardly registered as significant. Greta's mind raced with confusion. She had been prepared for harshness, for rough hands grabbing her, for taunts and insults from the guards, but nothing of the sort occurred. The Americans didn't seem to have the fiery hatred she had expected, and that made her uneasy. Her training as a soldier, her instincts to fight or flee, seemed utterly useless in this new reality. It was as if the rules she had lived by, rules that had been drilled into her during the war, no longer applied. The silence was oppressive in its own way, more unnerving than any violence could have been. They were marched through the camp in silence, the only sounds the soft shuffle of boots on the dirt road. The women were divided into small groups and led to separate barracks, where they would sleep, eat, and wait for whatever came next. Inside the barracks, there were real wooden floors and simple cots with blankets neatly arranged. The walls were bare and the windows had screens, letting in the dry, hot air from outside. It was stark and utilitarian, but compared to the hellholes of European prisons, it felt almost normal. It felt almost human. For the first time in weeks, Greta found herself questioning everything she had believed about her captors. She had been told to expect monsters, barbaric, inhuman creatures who would do unspeakable things to them. Instead, the camp felt like a place of procedure. Everything here was orderly, efficient, but there was no malice, no cruelty. There were no shouting guards, no physical violence. Greta couldn't understand it. She had expected to see a reflection of the brutality she had witnessed in the concentration camps back in Europe. Yet here she found nothing but apathy and cold professionalism. The women were given a few hours to settle into their new quarters. Greta lay on the cot, staring up at the bare wooden ceiling, her mind spinning. Everything was wrong, and yet everything was strangely calm. She could hear whispers around her, women talking in low voices, unsure of what to make of the situation. Some seemed relieved, almost grateful for the quietness of their new surroundings, while others, like Liesl, were suspicious of every detail. Liesl kept muttering that this was all part of the plan, to break them, to soften their resolve. She couldn't trust kindness from the enemy. But Greta wasn't sure what to think anymore. Later that evening, a bell rang, signaling the arrival of dinner. The women were escorted to a small mess hall where they were given bowls of simple food: gruel-like oatmeal for breakfast, sandwiches at lunch, and a meat and potatoes stew for dinner. The food was bland, but it was enough. Greta couldn't help but notice the difference from what she had been led to expect. The food in the German camps had been meager at best, and the treatment had been harsh. Yet here, despite their status as prisoners, the Americans seemed to be treating them with a level of dignity. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't cruelty either. The women ate in near silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound that filled the room. Greta sat at a table near the back, poking at her food. The stew was bland, but she was too distracted to care about the taste. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange politeness of the camp. It didn't make sense. She had been prepared for the worst, for open hostility, yet the treatment she received here seemed indifferent, almost humane. That was the problem. There was no hatred in the eyes of the American soldiers. There was no bitterness, no animosity, just a detached professionalism that felt like a slap in the face. They weren't the monsters she had been told they would be. They were something else, something more unsettling. After the meal, the women were escorted back to their barracks, and the doors were locked for the night. Greta lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with questions. What was the purpose of this? Why were the Americans treating them with such strange decency? Was this just a temporary reprieve, a false sense of security before something worse happened? The idea that there might be no cruelty waiting for them, only a cold and distant form of captivity, unsettled her more than anything else. She had expected to hate her captors, to feel rage and defiance, but instead, she felt confusion. The next few days passed in a blur. Each morning they were given their meals, and each afternoon they performed light work, washing clothes, cleaning barracks, and helping with various chores around the camp. The work was monotonous and repetitive, but it kept their minds occupied. Greta found herself falling into a strange routine. There were no beatings, no forced labor, no abuse. The guards maintained their distance, offering only the barest of commands. At first, Greta thought it was a trick, that this calmness was part of a greater scheme to disarm them. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The American soldiers were not the savages she had imagined. They didn't treat them like animals. They didn't torment them or take pleasure in their suffering. Instead, they followed the rules of war with an unsettling sense of normalcy. Greta couldn't reconcile this with everything she had been taught. She had been raised to believe that the Americans were the embodiment of everything evil in the world. Yet here they were, acting with a level of professionalism and even a sense of care she had never expected. It was a cruel irony. How could a woman like her, a prisoner of war, feel more like a human being here than in her own homeland? As the days turned into weeks, the initial shock began to wear off. Greta started to see small signs that the Americans were not entirely indifferent to their plight. There were no open acts of kindness, but there was a quiet respect. The guards, though distant, never raised their hands to them. The food, though simple, was enough to keep them alive. And every now and then a few small comforts arrived: blankets, fresh clothing, and other supplies. These were things that had been unthinkable in the camps back home. It was as if the war had not destroyed every vestige of human decency,
as if, despite everything, some small part of it still remained. But the lingering question remained: why? Why were they treated with this strange form of dignity when they had been trained to expect nothing but abuse?
The days stretched on, and with each passing one, Greta found herself torn between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. The camp had become a routine, a strange blend of monotony and growing unease. Every day they were given their meals and assigned tasks, none of which were particularly difficult or demanding. The work was nothing like the grueling labor she had been told to expect, yet the very ordinariness of it felt like a cruel joke. The fact that they were not being broken down, not being pushed to the edge of exhaustion, left Greta feeling confused and out of place.
Then, one afternoon, something happened that would shake the very foundation of her beliefs. A shipment arrived, care packages from the American Red Cross containing personal care items. As the crates were unloaded, a quiet murmur of disbelief spread across the women. Among the items were things that Greta had not seen in years: sanitary pads, tampons, soap, and hand creams. These were not just basic hygiene products. They were items that had long been reserved for the women of the privileged, the ones who had not known the horrors of war. Greta couldn't believe her eyes. In the midst of captivity, in a foreign land where she had expected to face unimaginable suffering, here were small luxuries, things that women in Germany had often gone without. The camp commander, a man who had rarely spoken to them directly, stood before the women and made an announcement. He spoke in slow, measured tones, telling them that these items had been sent in accordance with the Geneva Convention, which guaranteed that prisoners of war retain their dignity. The words felt surreal to Greta. Dignity? Was that possible in a place like this? She had been raised to believe that the enemy would strip them of everything that made them human. But instead, they were offering them a choice. These items, these small comforts, were a gesture of respect. They weren't forced upon them, but rather offered with an almost casual indifference. The women stood frozen, staring at the packages. Some hesitated, uncertain of what to do. Others seemed reluctant to accept anything from their captors, believing it to be some sort of trick. It was difficult to imagine that anything, no matter how small, could be genuinely given without an ulterior motive. But there they were, staring at the neatly packaged items, something so simple, yet so profoundly unexpected. It was almost too much to process. Greta found herself caught between two competing feelings: a deep sense of gratitude for something so basic, and the growing realization that her beliefs about the war, about her enemies, had been shattered. Liesel, standing next to Greta, spoke in a low, sharp voice. "This is how it begins," she said, her words tinged with bitterness. "They want us to forget who we are, to forget what we're fighting for." Liesel's suspicion was palpable, her distrust of the Americans unwavering. She believed that these gestures were meant to weaken them, to sow division, to make them soft. Greta, however, couldn't help but feel differently. She had spent the last few weeks in this camp, and while it was far from pleasant, it was also far from the nightmare she had been warned about. There was no cruelty, no violence, just a strange and unsettling indifference. And that, in its own way, felt like the most terrifying thing of all. Greta hesitated for a moment, looking at the box in front of her. The sanitary pads and tampons were nothing extraordinary, yet they seemed to embody everything that had been lost in the war. The idea that a woman could take such things for granted in times of peace was almost laughable now. But here, in this foreign land, they were being offered these small comforts, these simple acts of care. Greta's fingers trembled as she reached for a packet of pads, the weight of the decision heavier than she expected. She had been taught to reject anything the enemy offered, to resist any act of kindness that might soften her resolve. But the reality of the situation was that she needed these things. She needed them to feel human again, to hold on to some semblance of normality in a world that had been turned upside down. As she walked back to her barracks, Greta felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt because she had accepted something from the enemy, something that her countrymen would surely consider an act of betrayal. And relief because, for the first time since she had arrived in the camp, she felt a tiny flicker of dignity return to her. It was a small thing, but it mattered. In a world where everything had been taken from her, where she had been reduced to a mere number, this simple act of kindness, this small miracle, felt like a lifeline. That night, as she lay on her cot, Greta thought about the women around her. Some of them had taken the supplies, while others had refused. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if they were all waiting for something to happen, something that would prove the Americans' true intentions. Some women believed that accepting the supplies was a betrayal of their own people, while others saw it as a necessary act of survival. Greta understood both sides, but she knew that in the end it was a personal decision. It was not about what the others thought or what they would say. It was about what she needed to do to preserve her own sense of dignity. In the days that followed, the initial shock of the supplies began to wear off, and the women started to adapt to the new routine. They worked in the laundry, cleaned the barracks, and helped with various chores around the camp. Despite the mundane tasks, there was a strange sense of calm in the air. No one was being mistreated. No one was being punished. It was almost as if the camp were simply a holding area, a place to wait out the war, to pass the time until the world outside changed. Greta could hardly believe it. This was not the nightmare she had been warned about. The harsh, brutal enemy she had expected had never materialized. Instead, she was faced with something far more unsettling: indifference. And yet, there was something to be said for indifference. In a world consumed by hatred, by violence, by endless cycles of destruction, indifference seemed almost like a mercy. The American soldiers weren't interested in breaking them, in tearing them apart. They were simply following orders. They were doing their jobs, nothing more. For Greta, this realization was both a relief and a burden. She had expected to find monsters in this camp, but instead she found only human beings. People who, despite everything, were capable of treating others with a quiet sense of respect. It was not the mercy she had hoped for, but it was something that, for now, was enough to survive. As the days in the camp stretched on, the initial sense of shock began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The women of the camp, once united by their shared fate, began to divide into factions, each with differing views on how they should navigate their new reality. The unexpected kindnesses they had received, such as the sanitary products and the relatively humane treatment, had caused some to question everything they had been taught about their captors. For Greta, the tension between these conflicting perspectives was hard to ignore. She had always believed that the enemy was cruel and unyielding, but now, faced with this new reality, she wasn't so sure. Liesl, always quick to voice her opinions, became increasingly vocal in her disdain for the changes she saw around her. She was convinced that the Americans were trying to break them, to weaken their resolve through small gestures of kindness. "This is how it begins," Liesl would say, her voice tight with frustration. "First they give us makeup, then they'll take our pride. Don't you see? They want us to forget who we are, to forget what we're fighting for." Her words echoed in Greta's mind, but despite Liesl's certainty, Greta found it hard to believe that the Americans had such manipulative intentions. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her was beginning to accept that maybe things weren't as black and white as she had once thought. As more time passed, the women started to take sides. Some, like Liesl, rejected the comforts offered by the Americans. They refused to use the items provided,
seeing them as a form of psychological warfare, a way to undermine their resistance. Others, including Greta, began to use the supplies, albeit with lingering guilt. It was hard to ignore the fact that these small gifts provided them with a semblance of dignity, a feeling that they were more than just prisoners. But the division between the women grew as the debates over whether to accept or reject these gifts became a regular part of camp life. It was as if the camp, despite its relative calm, had become a battleground for their internal struggles, with the women trying to reconcile their own identities in a foreign land, under foreign rules. Greta found herself increasingly isolated from the others. Though she understood Liesel's distrust, she could not shake the feeling that there was something more to the Americans than cruelty. Her internal conflict was further compounded by Ruth, the American Red Cross worker who had first returned Greta's photograph of Annalise. Ruth had remained a constant presence in the camp, often stopping by to check on the women or assist with the distribution of supplies. At first, Greta had viewed Ruth with suspicion, but over time she began to see a different side of her. Ruth was not the heartless enemy she had imagined, but rather a woman who, despite her own grief, tried to offer what little comfort she could to the women. Greta had overheard Ruth speaking in German to some of the women, and though her words were always measured and carefully chosen, there was a palpable sense of sadness in her voice. It was a sadness that Greta recognized, one born from loss. Despite the quiet compassion that Ruth showed, Greta still struggled to accept the full extent of the Americans' intentions. Could they truly be acting out of genuine kindness? Or was it simply a more subtle form of control, a way to make the women feel weak and dependent? Greta couldn't quite bring herself to trust the latter explanation, but the doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Liesel's words haunted her, and the more she thought about them, the more uncertain she became. Was it possible that the Americans had an agenda beyond simply keeping them alive? Or was this really as simple as it appeared? A war prisoner camp where the Geneva Convention was being adhered to, no more and no less. One afternoon, as the women were gathered for another roll call, the tension between the different factions reached its peak. A fight broke out in the mess hall between two women, one of whom had been using the cosmetics they had been given, and the other who had refused. The woman who had been using the items argued that they were a small comfort in an otherwise grim reality, while the other accused her of being weak, of allowing the enemy to break her spirit. The argument quickly escalated, drawing the attention of the guards, who stood by, watching the scene unfold with detached interest. The women continued to shout at each other, their voices filled with frustration, anger, and fear. Greta watched from the sidelines, unsure of how to intervene. The division between the women had become too deep, too entrenched for her to bridge. That evening, as Greta lay in her cot, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of the two women, their faces contorted with anger and distrust. The camp, once a place of strange calm, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The cracks in the women's unity were widening, and Greta found herself caught in the middle, torn between the growing suspicion of her fellow prisoners and the strange compassion shown by the Americans. She had never felt more alone in her life. It was as if the very fabric of her identity was being pulled apart, piece by piece, and she wasn't sure what would remain when it was all over. The next day, Ruth came to the barracks to check on the women. As she moved through the room, she exchanged quiet words with each of them, offering small gestures of reassurance. When she reached Greta, their eyes met for a brief moment, and for the first time, Greta saw something in Ruth's expression that she had never noticed before: regret. Ruth's eyes held the weight of something deeper, something more personal. But it was gone before Greta could fully comprehend it, replaced once again by the carefully maintained neutrality that Ruth wore like a mask. In the days that followed, Greta's thoughts were consumed by what had happened in the mess hall and by the growing divisions among the women. She had never considered herself a leader, but it was becoming clear that someone would have to step forward to address the underlying tensions in the camp. The question was, could they ever come together again, or had the damage already been done? The realization that the camp, despite its apparent calm, was becoming a battlefield of its own troubled Greta deeply. The war she had fought on the outside had left scars, but the war inside the camp, between the women themselves, was far more insidious. It wasn't one they could fight with weapons. It was a war for their souls, for their very sense of who they were in a world that had turned upside down. And as the days went on, Greta realized that the true battle wasn't just against the enemy. They were fighting, too, against themselves. As the weeks went by, the camp began to feel like a strange, half-forgotten dream. The days were a blur of routine, meals, chores, and the quiet moments of reflection that always seemed to stretch too long. Greta could feel the weight of her uncertainty pressing down on her with each passing day. She had been a soldier, a mother, a wife. Now she was simply a prisoner, existing in a space that didn't seem to belong to anyone. The conflict inside her was growing. Could she reconcile the person she was before the war with the person she was becoming now, here in this camp? Greta's mind kept returning to the small things that had begun to alter her perception of the world around her. Those unexpected gestures of kindness, the sanitary products, the food that arrived on time, always enough to keep them from starving. But more than that, it was the silence that had taken over the camp. There was no cruelty, no shouts of rage, no violence. At first, it had felt like a relief, a small oasis in the chaos of war. But now it was suffocating. The indifference of the soldiers, the quiet professionalism, was becoming harder to bear. In a world where everything was dictated by violence, where hatred was bred like a virus, this lack of emotion felt unnatural, and yet it was what she was stuck with. The days continued to stretch on, and as the women worked, the emotional divisions between them grew sharper. There were those who still believed that the enemy must be resisted at all costs, even if that meant rejecting every kindness they were offered. Liesl remained one of the most vocal opponents of accepting anything from their captors. She believed it was a form of manipulation, a calculated strategy to break their spirits and make them forget who they were. Greta understood Liesl's fear, her mistrust. Liesl was still holding on to the hope that they could remain strong, even if it meant suffering. But Greta had started to wonder whether that strength was really what they needed now. Could they still be strong, even while accepting the small mercies that were being offered to them? One afternoon, after a long day of work, Greta found herself alone by the laundry building, her hands raw from the constant scrubbing. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across the camp. The sight of the sun sinking below the horizon always made Greta think of home, of Annalise and the life she once had. She longed for those quiet moments before the war, when she had been a teacher, a mother. She wondered what her daughter was doing now, what she looked like. It had been over a year since she had last seen her, and the thought of the little girl she had left behind filled her with an aching sadness. As she stood there lost in thought, Ruth appeared, her clipboard in hand. Ruth was a regular presence in the camp, always moving through the barracks and offering help where she could. She was nothing like the women Greta had imagined would be working in the camp. There was no malice in her eyes, no hate in her demeanor. In fact, Greta had started to wonder if Ruth, despite her status as an enemy, might not be more like her than either of them cared to admit. Ruth spoke to her softly, asking if she needed anything. It was the same question she had asked countless times before, but today, something in her voice caught Greta's attention. There was a sadness there, something that was unmistakable. Greta felt a strange pull, a desire to understand what had driven Ruth to be here, to take on this role, in this place. Was it out of duty, or was it something else? There was something vulnerable in Ruth's eyes, something that made Greta see her less as an enemy and more as a woman caught between two worlds. Greta's mind swirled with questions, but she didn't ask them. Instead, they stood there in silence, the noise of the camp fading into the background. For the first time, Greta saw Ruth as more than just an American Red Cross worker. She saw her as a person, someone who, like Greta, had her own story, her own pain. It was a strange feeling, one that Greta wasn't sure how to process. How could someone who had been a part of the enemy, someone who had stood on the other side of this war, be capable of showing kindness? And yet, Ruth had done so time and time again, without expecting anything in return. That evening, after Ruth had left, Greta returned to her barracks and sat on her cot, turning the small tube of lipstick in her hands. It was something so simple, so mundane, yet it felt like the most significant thing in the world. It was a symbol of something Greta could hardly comprehend. In that moment, she realized that accepting this small act of kindness did not mean that she had to forget who she was or what she had fought for. It didn't mean that she was betraying her country or her values. It simply meant that she was human, that she still had the capacity to accept grace, even in the darkest of circumstances. Over the next few days, Greta found herself thinking about Ruth more and more. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper between them, something unspoken. Ruth had shared a part of herself with Greta that she hadn't shared with anyone else. And in return, Greta had shared something too, her vulnerability, her humanity. It was a connection born out of the most unlikely circumstances, and yet it felt real, and it felt important. The more Greta thought about it, the more she realized that this was what had been missing all along, the ability to see others not as enemies, but as people. But even as Greta began to understand the depth of her connection with Ruth, the division among the women in the camp only deepened. Liesel's words continued to echo in Greta's mind, and she couldn't help but wonder if Liesel was right. Could these small kindnesses from the Americans really be part of a larger scheme? Were they trying to break them down, to make them weak? Or were they simply following the rules of war, treating them as human beings instead of animals? The more Greta thought about it, the more confused she became. There was no clear answer, no right or wrong. There was only the reality of what was happening and her struggle to make sense of it all. One evening, as Greta sat in the mess hall, the camp commander made an announcement. He spoke about the Geneva Convention, about the rights of prisoners of war, and about the dignity that all prisoners were entitled to. It was a simple speech, but it struck Greta deeply. Here was the heart of the matter. The Americans were not treating them like criminals or subhuman beings. They were treating them with respect, with dignity. It was something that Greta had never thought possible. She had been taught to believe that this was a war of survival, of us versus them. But here, in this strange camp, that dichotomy seemed to fall apart. Greta didn't know what to make of it all. She didn't know if she could ever fully accept the kindness that had been shown to her and her fellow prisoners. But as she lay in her cot that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized one thing. She had to keep trying to understand, to keep questioning. She couldn't let the war, either the one fought in the outside world or the one raging within her, define who she was. She had to hold on to something of herself, something human, even in this place, even in this madness. The days following the announcement were a blur of strange emotions and thoughts that Greta could hardly begin to understand. The camp, despite everything, had become a place where small acts of kindness became a form of survival, a flicker of humanity in a world torn apart by war. But the deeper she ventured into this realization, the more she questioned herself. What did it mean to accept these small mercies from the Americans? Was it a betrayal of everything she had once believed in? Or was it simply the only way forward in a world where everything had been lost? Greta couldn't ignore the growing discontent among the women. Liesel, along with others who still clung to their sense of German pride, saw the offering of kindness as a threat. They viewed it as a method of manipulation, a strategy designed to make them forget their strength, their identity, their very reason for resisting. Each day, the tension in the camp grew. Some women took the supplies, lipsticks, soap, even the sanitary products, treating them like a lifeline, a reminder that, even in captivity, they were still human. But others rejected them outright, unwilling to accept anything from their captors, feeling it would diminish their dignity. Greta, torn between these conflicting forces, spent most of her days lost in thought, unable to reconcile her own beliefs with the reality of the situation. She couldn't bring herself to completely embrace Liesel's view, yet she couldn't fully let go of her own suspicions about the Americans either. She didn't want to be deceived. She didn't want to become soft, to let go of the hardness that had kept her going through the darkest times. But at the same time, she realized that the softness wasn't the real danger. What scared her most was the possibility of losing the ability to feel compassion, to remain human in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. It was during one of her quiet moments of reflection that Greta realized the weight of what had changed within her. The small kindnesses, the hand creams, the sanitary pads, were more than just physical comfort. They were signs of something far more significant, the possibility of dignity in a place where dignity seemed impossible. They were a reminder that even in the darkest hours of captivity, there was still room for humanity, for empathy, for connection. And it was that connection, more than anything else, that began to change her. Over time, Greta began to speak more openly with the other women, though the conversations were always cautious, fragmented. Some of them had started to see the gifts differently, accepting them as small acts of mercy, while others, like Liesel, saw them as dangerous signs of submission. The divide between the two groups deepened as the weeks passed, but Greta no longer felt as lost as she had before. There was a sense of peace in understanding that she didn't have to choose sides. She could simply be herself, someone who was trying to survive, someone who was trying to hold on to what little humanity she had left. One day, as the sun set behind the camp's wire fences, Greta found herself sitting beside Ruth again. The woman's presence had become strangely comforting to her, despite the obvious tension between them. Ruth was always quiet, her eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow that Greta could never quite understand. But today, something had shifted. Ruth had come to sit beside Greta without the clipboard, without the formality that usually kept their conversations at a distance. They sat in silence for a long time, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filling the space between them. Finally, Ruth spoke. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly. "I know it's hard to accept what's happening here. I know it feels like everything we were taught is being torn apart." Her voice was strained, as if the words were difficult for her to say. "But you need to understand something. We're all trying to survive this, and that means we have to choose who we are, even in the darkest of places." Greta looked at her, her heart heavy with the weight of Ruth's words. She understood, in that moment, that the question wasn't whether she could accept the kindness being offered, it was whether she could still choose to be the person she wanted to be. In a world that had been shattered by war, where everything had turned upside down, could she still hold on to her humanity? Could she still choose to be someone who cared, someone who recognized the value of compassion, even in the face of overwhelming suffering? That night, after the conversation with Ruth, Greta returned to her barracks with a new sense of clarity. It wasn't about the makeup or the small comforts. It wasn't even about the war or the camp. It was about something deeper, something fundamental to her survival. It was about remembering that she was still a person, a mother, a woman who had the right to choose how she would live her life, even in the most challenging circumstances. The next day, Greta decided to reach out to Liesel. It wasn't an easy decision. She knew the other woman would not understand, that Liesel would accuse her of being weak, of falling into the trap that the Americans had set. But Greta felt that it was time to make a choice, to stand for something, to acknowledge the humanity that still existed in this broken world. She found Liesel by the laundry building, sitting with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Liesel," Greta said, her voice soft but steady, "we don't have to agree on everything, but we have to stop fighting each other. This place is hard enough as it is. We don't need to make it harder." Liesel looked at her for a long moment, her expression hard, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something Greta couldn't quite name. Finally, Liesel spoke, her voice rough. "You think they'll change us? You think this is how it happens? One small kindness at a time?" Greta nodded slowly. "No, it's not about them changing us. It's about us choosing who we are, no matter what they do to us. We have to hold on to ourselves, to who we are, even here." Liesel didn't respond right away, but she didn't pull away either. Greta realized that maybe, just maybe, this was a step toward understanding, toward rebuilding something, even if it was just the smallest fragment of what they had lost. As the days continued, Greta felt a quiet shift within herself. She no longer saw the camp as a place of total loss. It was still a place of captivity, still a place of uncertainty and pain, but it was also a place where small acts of mercy could be found. And in the midst of everything, Greta began to accept that mercy wasn't about deserving it. It was about choosing to give and receive it, no matter how small the gesture. The real battle, she realized, was not over survival. It was over keeping the humanity alive, even when everything around them threatened to strip it away.